Hello, good evening. My name is Emily Mead, and I am Chief Philanthropy Officer for the New Bedford Whaling Museum, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all here, a full house, to the New Bedford Whaling Museum this evening. Tonight's program will explore the rich history of the Azores and its connections to New Bedford. And this evening is part of our Portuguese and Lusophone World Lecture Series, which is an annual program series here at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. So thank you for joining us tonight. I also do want to take a moment to thank the people and organizations that have made this evening possible. This event is underwritten by the Department of Portuguese and Brazilian Studies of Brown University, with support from the Azorean Maritime Heritage Society and FLOD, the Luso-American Foundation of Lisbon, as well as the as well as the William M. Wood Foundation. It is also made possible by our sponsors, Bay Coast Bank, Ben Saud Hotels, the Consulate of Portugal in New Bedford, the Franchise Group, which we're delighted is here this evening, Portugalia Marketplace, and our media sponsors, WJFD 97.3 FM. Thank you, Colleen. I also want to acknowledge and thank the individual contributors that are listed on the screen behind me for their support this evening. And finally, I want to thank all of you who are museum members. Our members sustain everything that we do, and thanks to you, in 2025, we have had an all-time record high visitation this year to date. We have also hosted a series of sold-out public programs like this evening's, and we are fully booked out for school groups and field trips through the end of this school year. So you make everything possible that we do here at the museum, and I want to thank our members. So I'll take a moment here. If you are not yet a member, please do take a moment to sign up tonight so you can enjoy free admission for 12 months. You also will enjoy, as a member, 50% off ticketed events like this one this evening, and access to special member events, including our very first members trip to Cape Verde. So this is the first time we will be taking our members for a members trip in Cape Verde. That trip will be happening in October. And we're really looking forward to it. To join or to learn more about the Cape Verde members trip, please visit whalingmuseum.org. Now, to kick off the evening in earnest, I'm going to invite to the stage a longtime great friend of the museum, Massachusetts State Representative Antonio F.D. Cabral. Tony?
Well, good evening, and welcome to the museum. Isn't that wonderful? We have a full house, unbelievable. I would like to think probably because I'm making the introduction, right? That would be wonderful if that was the case, but I'm sure that's not the case. I'm going to stick to the script, and I'm going to be part of the panel, and then during that particular part of the program, I have little stories to tell you. If you are from Pico, if you were born in Pico or raised in Pico to a certain degree, whaling was part of your childhood. So there's lots of stories to tell, and some of them are wonderful. Pico and Fayal were the epicenter of whaling, really in the Azores. Whaling took place in other islands like St. George, Flores, São Miguel, and other places, also in Madeira, by the way. But the epicenter of that activity really was Pico and Fayal. That's where the American whalers used to stop in for supplies, for crew. You can see lots of beautiful paintings of American whalers in Horta and also along the coast of Pico. One of those is the Charles Morgan, actually, with the last voyage of the Charles Morgan, which today sits in Mr. Connecticut, is anchored on one of the paintings, is anchored right outside of the area of Pico, near Madalena area. But I'm going to stick to the program. I'll wait for the panel, and I have to use one of these, so if you don't mind. So tonight, as you know, it's called Echoes of Pico, Exploring Azorean Whaling History and Heritage. Welcome, everyone, to the Echoes of Pico, or Pico. That's actually the better pronunciation. Exploring Azorean whaling history and heritage. It's a pleasure to see so many of you and here tonight for what promises to be an enriching evening of cultural connection and storytelling. Together we will explore the powerful connection between New Bedford and the Azores, specifically the island of Pico. These connections are all around us. They span generations, oceans, industries, and continue to shape the identity of our community. Many of you here tonight already know this story, connection, whether it is through your own experience in the Azores, hearing stories from your grandparents, participating in cultural traditions, and joining in our shared history. Tonight, we are here to celebrate these stories and to dig deeper into stories we may not already know. We will begin our evening with the launch of Shades of Gray, of Black and Gray, an inquiry into the island of Pico and its history by Joel Silveira Avila. Joel was born in Fetais de Piedade on the island of Pico in the Azores and came to the United States as a child. He has devoted his life to exploring and preserving the history of his homeland. This book, written in question and answer format, takes us through the history of Pico, its discovery, its people, and its history. Joel reminds us how intertwined our two communities really are. Beyond this writing, Joel has served as an elected member of the planning board in the town of Dartmouth, Massachusetts, and recently retired from a career in information technology. Following Joel's presentation, we will watch a short documentary film, The Latest Azorean Whaleman, directed by Nick Francis. Nick is a talented filmmaker whose roots are here in Massachusetts and whose passion and talent have taken him all around the world. We are honored that his work has brought him back to the South Coast, where he is now the visionary officer of the franchise group, a South Coast-based creative and strategic marketing agency. His film captures the voices and the lives of whalemen from Pico and Fayal. Through them, we get a glimpse into the world of hard labor, brotherhood, and survival. Finally, we will close out with our evening with a panel discussion led by Sara da Silva Quintal, a first-generation Azorean American raised right here in New Bedford. Sarah manages ecological restoration for Buzzards Bay Coalition, but she is also a steward of culture, someone who enjoys sailing Azorean whaleboats and rowing, obviously. She will guide us through a thoughtful conversation with our two guests tonight and myself. Thank you again for being with us this evening. And let's begin our program with the author of Shades of Black and Gray. Please join me in welcoming Joel Silveira Avila.
Thank you, Tony, for that introduction. I expected you to relinquish your remaining time to me, but that didn't happen because there was no remaining time. But thank you. And thanks for everyone who's here tonight and to those who are on Zoom watching this. It's impossible for me to thank everyone who helped me with this project, but I need to acknowledge some of the folks who are already acknowledged, but the Brown University, the Whaling Museum, Denise Borges and Bruma Publishing, at Fresno State, who are the publishers of the book. And I'd especially like to thank Professor Unesmu Almeida. I don't know if he's here. He doesn't usually like to be recognized, but he wrote the preface to the book, and he encouraged me from the beginning of the project. And I have to say that, in all honesty, if it wasn't for him, this book would not have been published. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank my wife, Susan, for all her patience, and she's here tonight. You have to be patient with me a little bit. I'm still trying to get used to this clicker. Yes, yeah, I did. Okay, so here's the agenda. We'll talk a little bit about the book, not very long, and then we'll go through 5 major topics. A brief introduction to the Azores and the island of Pico, Pico wine, the Dabneys on Pico, whaling, and immigration. These topics, as you can imagine, are all very much interrelated, but I've tried to keep them as separate as possible. We only have 20 minutes before the film, and so I'd appreciate it if you could hold any questions until the round table at the end of the program. Okay, so this book took me 4 years to research and write, and 1 year to work with Bruma Publishing to get it printed. So, I mean, it's understandable if you're wondering why it took so long. I've got tons of excuses, some of them are on here, and the result was this question and answer format, 40 topics. But in all fairness, this does cover a period of 600 years, so there's really a lot of material in the book. So the first topic is a brief introduction to the Azores and Pico. And I've tried to structure the material so that it answers some of the questions of people who are not really very familiar with the Azores and Pico and are from outside of the Portuguese community. Okay, so what we have here is a map of the Azores, and as you can see, the Azores are located 2/3 of the way between the U.S. and Portugal in the middle of the Atlantic. And latitude-wise, it's approximately in line with Washington, D.C. and Lisbon, approximately. I mean, there are 9 islands, so it's tough to say that exactly. The distance between the most northerly island, which is Corvo, and the most southerly island, which is Santa Maria, is approximately 373 miles. Uh-oh. I seem to be going backwards here. Okay, here we go. So the next question is, where is the island of Pico? And so, if you can see, Pico is right here. Pico is right in the middle of the Azores. It's in the central group of islands. And it is a dormant volcano over 7,700 feet, which makes it the tallest mountain in Portugal. And area-wise, it's second only to São Miguel, which you see here. And so Pico has 3 municipalities and 17 civil parishes. And Pico and Faial are the closest of all of the islands. You can see Pico here and Fayal here, so the distance between them is only 6 kilometers across a very narrow channel. Pico was about 28.5 miles long, 16 miles wide at its widest point, and it has a population of just under 14,000 people based on the latest census, which is only 6% of the entire population, the bulk of the population being in San Miguel. So we have a picture here of Lage Pico, which is the island's first municipality. It was incorporated at the turn of the 1500s. It has no formal charter, or none that have been found by historians. And next we have Pico's second municipality, which is San Roque, incorporated in 1542. And somehow I've lost Medellina, but that is Pico's third municipality. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the settlement of Pico. And important to remember that we're talking about settlement here, not discovery, because discovery was earlier. And it's really a very different discussion. Oh boy. I feel like I could use a little bit of Pico wine just about now. Okay, the first settlers on Pico. This is one subject that there's some ambiguity about it, among other subjects. But the estimates vary pretty widely between 1460 and 1500. But I think the consensus and the best evidence points to settlement starting around 1460. And the first settler is acknowledged as Fernando Alvarez, or Alvarez. The settlement took place in 3 distinct waves. The first wave was by individuals from the island of Terceira, and they arrived on the south coast of Pico at Lage. Hence, Lage became Pico's first municipality. About 10 years later, settlers from Graciosa or São Jorge arrived on the north coast and founded San Roque. And I say Graciosa or São Jorge because there's ambiguity there as well. But that general area. And the third wave occurred in São Mateus near Medellina on the west coast after Huerta, the captain of Fayal, also became captain of Pico. And now that brings us to Pico wine. As I'm sure you know, Pico became famous internationally for its wine. So according to tradition, grapes were first introduced on Pico by the Franciscan friar Pedro Gigante. He's said to have arrived with the first settlers, and he also served as the first priest on Pico in the chapel of San Pedro in Lage, which is still there. Obviously, it looks a little bit different than it did originally in 1460, but it was the first house of worship on the island. Traditionally, there were 2 types of wine, vinho comum, which is literally common wine, a dry table wine, and vinho passado, which is a higher quality wine made from grapes that were allowed to be on the vine for a longer period of time. The favorable climate on Pico made it possible for at least a dozen varieties of grapes to be grown, including the most important and dominant Verdelho. The friars mastered the recipe for, the traditional Pico wine very early, and it was a blend of Verdelho as the main base, Alicante, Boal, Malvácia, Circial, and Bastardo. Unfortunately, I don't have any samples for anyone. There are no remaining bottles of the original recipe, so we can only guess that it was very flavorful. During the 1700s, wine was so important to Pico's economy that it generated approximately 80% of Pico's total tax revenues. But unfortunately, the industry came to a screeching halt around the 1850s. And the first problem was the blight of the powdery mildew that arrived on Pico during the summer of 1852. It caused devastation to the grapevines and left the Pico wine largely as a product for only local consumption. And then to make matters worse, in 1873, the phylloxera insect arrived and made it even worse. So estimates of annual production on Pico are also very ambiguous, but some of the estimates before the blights range from 12,000 to 15,000 barrels. But some people have even estimated as high as 25,000 barrels. By 1867, production had been reduced to less than 100 barrels. That's how much the vineyards were affected by the blights. And as a result, residents resorted to planting a variety of American wines, primarily Isabella, and Verdelho was practically lost as a commercial wine on Pico and was replaced by Vinho de Cheiro. And in fact, over time, many local residents even have forgotten or had forgotten that Verdelho was the traditional Pico wine and not the Vinho de Cheiro. And so what we have here is a photo of the Currais de Vinha in Madalena that are part of a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And these stone walls have been restored and are very much part of an important landscape on Pico. And as you can imagine, or you actually can see that there's a lot of gray and black that dominate the landscape, which is one of the reasons why the book is called Shades of Black and Gray. And so the next major topic is the Dabneys on Pico. Most people familiar with the Dabney family know that their presence was instrumental on Fayal, but the family also had strong ties to Pico. In fact, it was Pico wine that first attracted John Bass Dabney to the Azores, the first consul to reside in Fayal. And so we have Fred Dabney here tonight somewhere. I'm sure he'll correct me if I misstated anything about his family. The Dabneys were so influential during the 19th century that they were dubbed, that century has been dubbed the Dabney century in the Azores. The family included 3 generations of American consuls over a period of 21 American presidents starting with Jefferson to Garfield. They acted as ships' agents, providing supplies, especially to American whaling ships. They transported passengers and freight between Boston and Horta, and they encouraged Azoreans to send out their own whale ships. They were also instrumental in the introduction of shore whaling on Pico, which is the subject of much of the discussion tonight. Importantly, they provided grain to the islanders during years of famine, including Pico, and it's a contribution for which they're still remembered for those folks that are interested in history. With regards to Pico, they purchased a number of vineyards on the island, and significantly, they had a summer cottage in Area Larga that they called the Priory, because they had once been owned by Carmelite monks. And so here we have a sketch by Samuel Longfellow of this summer cottage called the Priory from 1843. Samuel, it's interesting that he was the younger brother of the more famous Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who anyone who's familiar with American literature would recognize. He, among other things, he tutored the Dabney children on Pico and Fayal between 1843 and 1844. And during this period, he drew sketches of Pico and Fayal and wrote letters home to his family describing his stays at the Priory. And so we are fortunate that the sketchbook is still available and that it includes a sketch of the Priory. Unfortunately, there's been much confusion about the exact location of the Priory. And it became sort of a personal quest for me to actually locate the exact location for this summer cottage. And after quite a few missteps, I ran across this photograph, which is housed at the public library north of Fayal, and it became sort of a Rosetta Stone that conclusively, for me at least, identified the location of the property. And it did that because down here, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a label here called the Priory, and it's in line with this building right here. And so you can see that the barco is in line with the boat, and that the Priory here is in line with that building. And so to me, that was fairly definitive evidence of where that summer cottage had been located. And so armed with that information, I looked through some of the museum's photographs that they have from the Dabney albums. And here are a couple of photographs that are, in fact, of the Priory. So you can see, you can see this structure here in the background. That's the Priory, and the beautiful photograph of these women with clothes that they've either washed or about to wash. And then here it is again. And so these are a couple of examples of photographs of the Priory. There are others, but in the interest of time, I did not include them. And so having that information, I checked with the neighbors, and they pointed me to an architect in Fayal who actually worked on the structure during 1960. And he was responsible for a project that demolished half of it to make room for the tuna factory in Área Larga. And his name is Carlos Garcia. He made this drawing for me, and this is the Priory here. These are a couple of ancillary buildings that you might remember were in the actual photographs that we saw earlier from the 19th century. And that brings us to the role of Azoreans in American whaling. The Azorean contribution to American whaling has been documented, well documented, and especially here at the museum. But the first documentation of American whaling in the Azores was in the mid-1760s. And it wasn't until July 19th, 1808 that the first Azoreans were actually documented on American whale ships, and whale ships from New Bedford. And those two individuals were Emmanuel Joseph, a 17-year-old from Pico, who sailed on the Maria, and Joseph Rose, of the same age, who was from Flores, and he sailed on the ship Sally. Again, both of these ships sailing from New Bedford. The Azorean presence in the American whale fishery rose from about 40% during the 1800s to 60% by 1920. And by the end of the whale fishery, the majority of ships had Portuguese captains. At least 8 of these captains had been from the island of Pico and are highlighted in the book. Generally speaking, the most successful whalers were those who left the island as cabin boys at an early age. And as you might imagine, they picked up the English language very quickly, and some of them were actually educated on the whaling ships based on the captains who helped them with some education. And as we all know, many of these Azorean whalers settled in New Bedford. And so I apologize for all of the stuff on this slide, but this slide talks to the crossroads of the intersection of whaling, immigration, and religion. And so in 1857, directly across the street here at the Seamen's of Bethel, the Reverend Howe was very active in assisting whalers, and he was also determined to convert the Catholic whalers to Protestant religion. And he wrote in his journal that and I'm just going to read this, a Portuguese who has lately returned from sea and been converted on board the bark Belle of Fairhaven spoke and prayed at the Bethel. He appears to be a very excellent man. He is a native of Pico, which I think is just a typo for Pico, and wants to go home and tell the people what the Lord has done for his soul and try to do good among the children by learning them and to read the Bible. Now, I mean, this is all well and good. To me, this sounds like this man from Pico wanted some help, some facilitation in getting him back to Pico, so he promised to try to go back and convert the local residents. But that's just a suspicion that I have. On a personal note, my great-grandfather, Manuel Joaquim de Silveira, from Calheta de Nisquim on Pico, stowed away on the New Bedford whale ship Napoleon during 1881, and the logbook is here at the museum. His departure, it sounds just like Dias de Melos Padres Negros, and could easily have been the model for that story. I'm not suggesting that he was actually the model, but he could have been. You might imagine that people left under very similar circumstances. And after 10 years of working as a fisherman, Manuel became a U.S. citizen. At some point, and the point of this is that he became a Protestant and returned to Pico. We know this because he was charged with singing a Protestant hymn at a funeral for a 5-year-old boy on Pico in 1902. Apparently that was taboo. You could not be singing Protestant hymns and not wind up in a slammer. But he couldn't be tried because by then he was in the U.S. again. He had returned. And he was married to my great-grandmother, Maria Garcia de Silveira, by a justice of the peace in Boston in 1903. They returned to Pico to raise their family, including my maternal grandmother, who raised her family as Seventh-day Adventists. And so while other immigrants in New England were assisted and found faith in their clergy, many Azoreans had practically lost their faith because they lacked Portuguese-speaking clergy. This would have been before 1870. As a result, the Azoreans in New Bedford begged or demanded, depending on your perspective and who you listen to, that the bishop send a Portuguese priest to the community. And by the time that the priest arrived in New Bedford in 1869, he observed that many Azoreans had been rebaptized or had baptized their children in Anglican churches. This is according to the priest. And this priest was Father João Inácio de Azevedo Encarnação, which is a mouthful. But so he was referred to as Ignatius, Father Ignatius. And he happened to be from the same parish that I'm from in Piedade on Pico. On September 10th, 1871, Father Ignatius founded the first Portuguese parish in the U.S., St. John the Baptist Church, and the church was the church is still there on County Street. And he was one of several priests from Pico who were instrumental in opening several Catholic churches and parishes in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And so here we have a famous picture of whaling ships at Orta. Many of them were probably New Bedford whaling ships. This is towards the end of the whaling era in 1890. Oops. And this is an illustration from Scribner's that represents Azorians leaving Salto, or as stowaways on American whalers. And so, like my great-grandfather who returned to the Azores, these stowaways who returned contributed to the economy, and some introduced shore whaling on the islands. So we know that shore whaling began in the Azores around 1860 and on Pico in 1876, using American boats, canoes, and American equipment. And so this is my interpretation of the historical record. There are people who say it started earlier, but in terms of documented activities, I believe that the shore whaling started in 1860. By the end of the 1800s, as Tony mentioned, Pico had become the capital of whaling in the Azores. And there were two main phases of shore whaling on Pico. One, each of them lasting 50 years. The first period from 1870 to 1930 was one that's been called pure cooperation, where the whalers were both shareholders and crew members. From 1930 to 1982, that was the second phase, and it was characterized by a consolidation, and the whalers lost basically the control of the industry with the opening of factories in Lage and Saint-Roch. And those factories applied industrial technology to process the entire whale. And then during the 1920s, launches, which are motorized motorboats, were first introduced, and this was a great advancement because it eliminated the time and effort of rowing from shore to the whales and manually towing the whales back to port, which you can imagine must have been a real effort. In 1935, the industry employed approximately a total of 250 men. On peak, that is. And so we have here a bust of Captain Anselmo de Silveira in Calheta de Nisquim. He was a naturalized American citizen who returned from the American whale fishery to his native parish. And he partnered with Samuel Willis Dabney, again going full circle to the Dabneys, and Samuel's son-in-law, George Oliver, and they established the first official whaling company in the Azores in 1876. And under that contract, that formal contract, the Dabneys provided a whaleboat and equipment, and Captain Anselmo assumed responsibility for the boat and obtained a local crew. And so what we have here is, what we had here was a photo of whaling off of Calheta de Nisquim, approximately 1970. And then a couple of photos of whales being processed in the whale factory in Saint-Roch, which is a subject that Zé Ribeiro is very familiar with. He has probably hundreds of other photographs like this. So in terms of immigration, the main causes of immigration, this won't come as any surprise to anyone, is that there was a great deal of poverty and poor economic conditions that drove people to leave, and basically to search for a better life like any other immigrants. And there was also a secondary cause of people avoiding the military service. This is something I learned which surprised me, that Brazil was actually the first destination for Azoreans emigrating starting as early as the 1600s, so you can imagine people were just getting there to the Azores, and at the same time they were already immigrating to Brazil. And the shift to the US only began in the 1800s with the arrival of American whaling ships. In 1803, an observer noted that the Azoreans who couldn't work as farmers only had two options. They could either join the church, which some of them did, or they immigrated, which more of them did. And so by 2021, immigration had been so common that Pico's population was barely half of what it had been in 1866, at the beginning of the blights for the vineyards and the arrival of American whale ships. And in terms of immigration, there were three distinct phases, and I'm be wrapping up shortly. During the first phase, from 1840 to the 1880s, immigrants departed to Salto, as we learned earlier, as stowaways on whaling ships, and they found work on New England fishing boats and farms in California. Many were attracted to California by the gold rush, but in New Bedford, there were so many Azoreans that Water Street became known as Little Fayal. During the second phase, from the 1870s to the 1920s, the Azoreans took advantage of different opportunities. For the most part, immigrants to the East Coast worked in the textile mills. In California, farming was still the major occupation during the early 1900s, and many Azoreans eventually became independent farmers there. And the third phase of Azorean immigration started up again in the early 1960s and continued until the end of the 1900s. I think many of you are familiar with the Kapling volcano on Fayal in 1958. That resulted in 1,500 visas to residents of Fayal and Pico. Those are visas, not, so the number of people would have been greater. And then the Immigration Act of 1965 enabled the departure of thousands of other Azoreans to America. And so they arrived mostly in areas that had already been occupied by earlier immigrants, and that caused reinforcement of the traditional Portuguese culture in those communities. And so, as you might imagine, immigration had both positive and negative effects or impacts. And so what we see here is an example of the negative impact of immigration on the island of Pico, where you have basically abandoned houses. And, it's worse in some parishes than others, but, it's pretty striking if you go there and you haven't been there for, well, if you go there and you see these ruined structures. And then in closing, I think it's clear that the history of Pico is also an American story. As we've mentioned earlier, the American Dabney family had intimate ties to Pico during the Dabney century and maintained an ongoing relationship and bridge to the U.S. The experienced whalers who went out on American whale ships returned from the U.S., bringing American whaling skills and capital to Pico. And in fact, when one English writer, Joseph Bullard, climbed Pico in 1839, one of the guides already spoke English, demonstrating that the guide had already been to the U.S., where he had learned English. And returning immigrants had a significant impact on Pico's economy, language, culture, and architecture. To the point where, it's now difficult to find Pico residents without family members in New England, California, or Toronto. And so that's the end of the presentation. This is a photo of the cover of the book. The books will be available for sale at the museum bookstore. But if you either buy it or don't buy it, if you have any questions or comments or corrections, this is my email address, and feel free to send me those questions or corrections, and I'll try to respond to your emails.
Thank you, Joel.
Thank you.
And now please welcome Nick Francis to the podium.
Thanks.
Bom tarde. All right. Joel, thank you. That was wonderful. I have a few minutes just to set up the film, but Joel did such a wonderful job telling you all about Pico and touching on whaling. I'd rather embarrass a few people that are in the audience, if that's okay. I'd also like to give them a round of applause, but if you can wait until I'm finished, that'd be great. First, and if you could stand too, Luis Felipe, if you could please stand up. Luis Felipe here in the back. Without him, this film wouldn't have come to be. He approached me back in 2010 with the idea to make a documentary connecting New Bedford to the Azores, myself being Azorean and himself being Portuguese from mainland Portugal, and having gone to high school and college here in Massachusetts. It was a natural connection for the two of us to get together and tell the story. Paul Raposo, who's also here. Paul, where are you? Paul is the editor of the film, and his family, aunts, uncles, mom, dad, all helped us translate the film. It was quite the endeavor with several moments of Azorean slang that no one could really understand the intent as it related to whaling, so we wanted to make sure we got it right. Victor and Rosemary Rebello, where are you? You're right here. Victor and Rosemary were so kind to have a family home in Pico that we could stay at in a small village just outside Lage de Pico. And another woman in the village, I'm unsure of who she was, came running down the hill to let us in when we got there, and she gave us a car for the week, which was fantastic for us to be able to get around and make the film happen. And then if I could have Elmo Melo's family and Almiro Machado's family please stand up just to be recognized. Many of them in the audience here. Elmo was the first individual that we interviewed. Unfortunately, he didn't make it into the film, but we had a fantastic time at his home with lots of great artifacts and small miniatures of whale ships and different things that he collected over the years. And Senor Machado was the second person we interviewed, and serendipitously, he happened to be in Pico on holiday as well when we went, so we were able to include him and film him there. And he's just such an important part of the story, and capturing sort of the untold stories of all of these gentlemen in a way that we didn't expect, I think is just really fantastic and really meaningful, and probably the most important part of my personal journey with the project. And then, of course, the New Bedford Whaling Museum gave us some archival footage. Lage de Pico's Whaling Museum was instrumental in helping us. And there's so many more folks that were a part of it, but I think without further ado, let's watch the film.
Muito. O meu nome é Francisco Joaquim Machado, mas conhecem-me mais em todas estas ilhas aqui o barbeiro, põe entre parentes. É o barbeiro, está a perceber? É a pesca da baleia, e os primeiros botes vieram dos Estados Unidos, porque foi pessoal que foi embarcado em baleeiras que a gente chamava, que ouvi falar, ouvi dizer, não vi, de salto, saltavam na calheta, saltavam acolá, que era proibido, e isso queriam safar da tropa, rapazes novos, e saltavam naquelas baleeiras para a América. E é aí é que principiou a geração claro, rapazes novos, depois casaram, que formaram família e tudo mais. E daí é que veio os primeiros baleeiros e os primeiros botes da América aqui para os Açores.
As primeiras canoas baleeiras que vieram para os Açores eram as tradicionais, que existe uma no Museu de New Bedford. E foi andando e depois principiou aqui na Aguada e vários sítios dos Açores principiaram a ir andando e foram ampliando, foram experimentando. Isto foram tudo obras sem riscos técnicos, foram tudo só por eles, foram experimentando, por curiosidade, porque isto eram considerados artesãos, não eram para fazer aquilo. Quanto a gente aqui era estações de terra, as embarcações eram maiores. Mas veio copiado, foi da terra da América. Sempre fui embalado com isso.
Meu avô foi baleeiro, meu pai foi baleeiro. Eu tinha um irmão também, mas eu, era mais velho que eu, também foi baleeiro. Isto naquelas épocas, quase toda a gente era baleeiro. O ferreiro, o carpinteiro, o alfaiate até ia, o barbeiro também ia, está a ver? Toda a gente, no geral, quase toda a gente ia.
E porquê?
Porquê? Para ver se ganhava uma coisinha no fim do ano para ajudar a compensar as despesas da casa. Não era só, numa terra desta, só um ofício. Não dava. Não dava para sustento da família.
Isso naquele tempo era triste. Agora está tudo mais evoluído, mas naquele tempo era triste. Porquê? Porque eram pobres, não tinham, cada um trabalhava os seus quintais, agora já não, agora já tem. No meu tempo já tinha a fábrica da conserva e tinha a fábrica da baleia, sempre tinha alguns, mas era muito triste.
Para mim o que dava mais dinheiro eram os dentes. Os dentes só pertencia só para a tripulação. O óleo, farinhas, que era farinhas de carne e dos ossos, aquilo era dividido ao fim do ano. Era tirada uma parte, que era a maior parte, era para as companhias, depois uma parte minúscula é que pertencia aos marinheiros.
Aquilo dependia porque aquilo era, por exemplo, fazia-se a caça durante praticamente o ano. E ao fim do ano é que se partia. Eu lembro-me de fazerem soldados de 1.500 escudos, conforme a quantia de baleias. Aquilo não era portanto, um fixo o dinheiro. Era conforme o que se apanhava. Ou mais ou menos, dependia daquilo que se apanhava. Pois, mais tarde apareceu os dentes, principiaram a deixar uns escudos. Tinha uma coisa que apareceu, e depois desapareceu quando veio às fábricas, que era o âmbar, que também deixava muito dinheiro. E eram estas coisas. Não tinham mais nada. E as terrinhas que se trabalhava às terras era a ajuda, era o equilíbrio entre uma e outra para poderem sobreviver.
Ao princípio, quando meu pai e eu principiei de novo, o vigia, que está no alto, a gente tinha 2 vigias, todos os aeroportos têm um vigia para vigiar. E o sinal era uma bandeira preta e uma branca. Quando a gente via a bandeira preta na ponta do mastro da cana, era a baleia vista por nosso vigia. Se era a bandeira preta e a branca, era botes fora, que é o botes adversários da Ribeiras e Calheta, e a baleia a coisa. E quando era só a bandeira branca, era botes fora. O nosso vigia não havia baleia.
Eu muitas vezes estava lá em cima no mato e largava as carreiras, largava as canecas de leite e largava as carreiras para apanhar os botes, para apanhar, para ir para a baleia. Tinha que ser.
O pessoal corria tudo para os armazéns de onde estão os botes. E aí cada um já sabia qual era o seu bote que ia. Isto mais tarde, que ao princípio não era assim, que havia gente a mais. Quando havia gente a mais, era que saltava mais rápido. Mais tarde, ficaram articulados 7 em cada canoa, e cada qual já sabia o seu bote e o seu lugar. E corriam para aí, para arriar. E arriavam o bote o mais depressa possível. E a lancha, e os motoristas e o mestre de lanchas, e um par de lanchas, estavam a trabalhar, que era para pegar nos botes e arrancar em direção às baleias. E depois, a lancha tinha o rádio e estava falando com a vigia. A vigia está dizendo, mais à esquerda, mais à direita, ela está por baixo, assim, e é assado. Iam conversando. O arpoador é o homem da frente, que é o que arpoa a baleia. Também a esse cabe um bocado de responsabilidade e de cuidado. Não deve arpoar a baleia em qualquer situação, porque se a baleia não está em boas condições para arpoar, ele não deve arpoar a baleia, porque está sujeito ela a partir o bote e até pisar alguém ou matar até. Aquilo quando vai com o rabo ou com a cabeça, não diz sai-te lá, é o que está, leva. O oficial é como o outro que tem toda a responsabilidade em cima dos ombros. Esse é que tem tudo. É que deve manobrar de forma que não haja prejuízo. Que não haja prejuízo. Que às vezes aparece. Ninguém está livre disto ou daquilo. Mas eu tenho mais responsabilidade de tudo. E mais cuidado, manobras e cálculos. Tem que fazer cálculos. Quando para apanhar a baleia não é só eu vou por aqui fora e vou parar aqui. A gente depois de ver um cachalote ou um cardume, a gente tem uma posição que tomar, porque não é só uma canoa, são muitas canoas e todas querem o mesmo pão. E a gente tem que fazer manobras de forma, nem todas as vezes corre bem entendido, mas manobras para ver se quando elas vierem à superfície saiam perto da gente. Porque quem apanha é muito bom. É como um jogador de futebol, marca gols, esse é que é bom.
Posso fazer uma pergunta? Porquê que há touradas de praça? E aos matadores? Os defensores dos matadores, os defensores das baleias e dos golfinhos, não vão aos matadores ver a salvajaria que existe. Só as baleias é que sofrem. Pois se matou baleias. Não foi por troféus, foi para matar a fome aos seus familiares, que era a única coisa que existia naqueles tempos, que deu mais uns dinheirinhos, era aquilo. Não houve ninguém que pusesse medalhas ao peito por matar baleias. Nem se sentiam superiores por matar um cachalote, ninguém. Matavam por sobrevivência.
Olha, vou-te dizer, é perigoso, é. É perigoso, mas quando me dizem a mim, é perigoso, eu digo, e as outras vidas não são perigosas? Porque aquilo é perigoso, é um animal irracional, que a gente, quando é arpoado, vem com a cauda ou com a cabeça, já sabe. Quem se sente picado quer se safar. Portanto, eu o que dizia que é perigoso, mas a gente, debaixo já da muita prática que tínhamos, é como um condutor de carro, um jogador de futebol, muito bem treinado, tem todas estas qualidades. E a gente tem que ter um medo de raciocínio e de inteligência. Eu tinha medo de apanhar uma pancada, eu e os meus companheiros. Mas a gente tinha como um dever e uma obrigação de tentar para chegar o mais perto e apanhar a baleia. Medo, todos têm medo, mas é um medo com inteligência. A nossa canoa baleeira é uma embarcação de respeito, de qualidade, que é um brinco ver uma embarcação daquelas em cima do mar.
Eu gostava da pesca da baleia. É uma pesca perigosa, mas eu gostava.
Porquê?
Porque era uma alegria, a gente sempre ganhava alguns centavos.
Agora gosto mais é de ver os animais. Vê-los e conservá-los. Tenho que respeitá-los, em primeiro lugar. Se ver animais, isso é uma coisa de outro mundo.
Você sente orgulho de ser baleeiro?
Eu sinto orgulho, sim. Da vida que fiz com muita vontade, tudo que fiz. Não fui à sorte. Eu tudo que fiz com orgulho. Porque a pessoa que em qualquer arte, que não tem orgulho, que não tenha força de vontade de fazer alguma coisa, nunca dá muito. É sempre a zero. A pessoa tem que se esforçar para fazer aquilo que gosta de fazer.
Você ainda sente-se baleeiro?
Ainda sinto saudades daquilo, porque foi das artes que eu adorei. As artes que eu adorei, vamos perceber uma coisa, a arte que eu me referi é à competição, não o prazer de matar, não, a competição, de chegar, nem chegar, manobra, tudo, aquelas coisas todas, espetacular. Gostei daquilo e sinto aquilo.
Amazing. Thank you. Let's welcome our panelists to the stage. Representative Tony Cabral, Sarah Quintal, Nick Francis, and Joel Avila.
Sitting under your.
There we go. There we go. Great. That was the most fun evening I've had in a while. The film touches so many emotions in me personally, one of which is because my uncle Aldemidu is there, who has passed away, and we're fortunate to have some of his children here today, Nancy and Roy. And seeing him on screen, I am so thankful that you were able to capture those interviews as you did, because it really captures so many of those stories that so many of us listened to when we were young, but not everybody was able to capture with an iPhone like we do today. So the next best thing is having filmmakers who are able to have the foresight to realize that we need to capture these moments in time and these stories before they disappear. So huge thank you for that. And Joel, ironically, I only met for the first time last week, but it turns out we're cousins through marriage.
It's a true story.
And I had the great pleasure of being able to see a preview of Joel's book last week. And, you know, so my mother is from Pico, from São Caetano, and many of my family members are here tonight. And, you know, so I grew up with a lot of the stories. You know, I had a mother who was a history teacher, and so, you know, you hear a lot about your culture. But then I opened up Joel's book, and I sat with Joel for coffee, and there was so much I didn't know. I really do think you had a remarkable way of taking a lot of information over 600 years, but putting it into a really readable format. So one of the things that Joel noted is that he framed out his book in this question and answer style, which I thought made boiling down the essence of all of this history really, really approachable. And basically, you have a question about your culture. You have a question about, well, how did shore whaling begin, or how did something begin? And so there's this beautiful index in the front of the book that poses these questions that, depending on your mood, you can select any one of the things that you happen to be thinking about that time and read a few pages on it. And I thought that that was a beautiful way to really boil down something that can sometimes feel overwhelming for someone who just casually wants to pick up a book and learn a little bit about a topic. But I really felt as though you remarkably were able to distill it into these bite-sized pieces of interesting questions. So for those of you, even if you don't like to do a whole lot of reading, I highly encourage you to pick up a copy of Joel's book, because it really, really, I thought, brought in those sort of essential questions. And one of the things that I want to pose to this panel is, why did you choose to dive into these projects? And so I'm going to start with you, Joel, because someone from Pico, why did you feel like you needed to dive in? What was your goal in creating this book?
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks for those kind words. I would recommend that exactly what you said, that anyone who has the book, don't feel daunted by how long it is, but pick a particular question and dive into that question. In any event, as Sarah mentioned, I was born on Pico, and I came here when I was 7 years old. And I would go back from time to time, and so Pico has been in my blood. You know, all of my ancestors, I mean, every single one of them are from Pico. So Pico has always been very important to me. And I thought that at some point I might write something about the Azores. I used to work at Dave Nelson's bookshop downtown. Former sheriff is here with his wife tonight. And I collected a few books about the Azores, and I even started making some notes and thinking that I would write something. But it became overwhelming for me, so I put that project down. And then when I retired 7 years ago, I decided that it was either now or never. And so I picked up more material on Pico specifically, and it sort of was a good combination for someone who wanted to stay active, mentally anyways, in retirement, and someone who wanted to learn more about their culture and the island where they were from. So it helped reinforce my identity as someone from Pico, and I learned a great deal in the process.
And a follow-up to that, what's next?
So I started working on researching the Franciscans friars on Pico. And for those of you who don't know, all of the monasteries were dissolved in 1834 in Portugal, including the ones on Pico. And those monasteries played a significant role in the history of the island and of the Azores and Portugal as well. And so that story I don't think has been told. And if anyone has any information, if you have any documents in your attic about the Franciscans, I would love to talk to you about them, because there's not really a lot available.
Thank you. And Nick, you touched upon this when you were beginning to introduce the film, but I'm curious if you wanted to add to any of your thoughts on how much of your life did it take to put together this film? How much time have you invested in it, and why? Why did you want to really dive in?
So Luis Felipe and I met at Mirasol's probably 2009, 2010, and talked about the idea initially. And it was an immediate yes for me, just because of my Portuguese heritage, and I don't know a lot about it. I'm several generations removed from our family coming to the United States. So I thought it gave me a good opportunity to imagine what it could have been like for our family, who might have been fishers and whalers at the time, as they followed fishing and whaling around the world. And a great opportunity to work with a friend and tell some stories of folks that wouldn't normally have the opportunity to capture stories in this fashion. So really it just came down to, how do we do that? And, both of us recently out of college and not a lot of money in the bank. So, thankfully the Azorean government gave us a grant to pay for our expenses to go there. And it just sort of fell into place. I think I touched upon the story that we wanted to tell, which was connecting New Bedford to the Azores, turned into much more about the Azores and whaling, because it was so different than it was here in New Bedford and Nantucket, as we know, with the larger whaling ships. But it just happened to just fall into place so perfectly. We showed up the first night. The Whaling Museum in Lage de Pico had a photographic series that it was the opening night on Azorean whalers at the museum. And the Whaling Museum invited us to go, and we walked in, and here are all these whalers in the room. And we just, one by one, went to each of them and found individuals that were interested in being interviewed, and lined up interviews throughout the course of the week, and finished with Senor Sousa, who has made his entire living off of whaling. He went right from whaling when it was banned in the Azores in 1984 to whale watch tours. And so everyone thought he was crazy. And so he still has, I'm not sure if he still has a whale watch tour today, but he had one in 2010 when we were there. And he brought us out. And when the whales are in the water, you're in the boat. They're very respectful of the whales. It's a very respected thing for them. But when 200 dolphins come across the bay, he points at us and told us to get in the water, and we got to dive in the water with 200 wild dolphins, which was really neat. But I mean, the entire story was just really incredible, and I think, just seeing it again for the first time, Paul, who was the editor, was joking, we haven't watched it since we were in Amsterdam at DocFeed, which is a really large documentary film festival in 2020, right before COVID. That was the last time we really watched it, and to see it again, it's, again, your emotion says it all. It's so important, and so many people in the room have a connection to it in some way, which is cool. Sorry, long-winded answer to your question.
No, I think it's great. And I really love the poignant questions that were asked in there, and I think Manuel Alming really touched upon it, I think, rather profoundly about, how whaling was outlawed, but it wasn't about killing the whale. It was about providing for our families. And for him, he noted how it was about the competition. And at least that's what made it sort of exciting. It was a necessity in so many ways, but it was about the competition. And that makes me think about how today, through Azorean Maritime Heritage Society, we use the whaleboat as a very real connection. As our founder, Mary Vermette, had said back in 1997, when she saw that first whaleboat being constructed in Orta, the first whaleboat to be built in 50 years, it's profound. It's a symbol of something that's been outlawed, so you could give it this label of something that's bad or taboo, but it's a symbol of so much more than that. It's a symbol of our culture for sure, but why? Why is it still a draw? And I think Manuel Alming kind of hit it on the head for at least one piece of that. Number one is this cultural piece that directly connects us with anyone from the Azores, but Pico in particular. There is very likely going to be whaling history in your family's in your family line, because so many people had to do it. And so there's that instant connection. But why are we still caring about it today other than that story? And for those of us with Azorean Maritime, who we row and sail these boats in Clark's Cove, it's history, it's culture, but in Manuel Alming's words, it's the competition. It's that excitement. We certainly are not hunting whales anymore, but being able to get into a boat that they're not the most stable things. They can tip. But that's part of that competition piece that makes it exciting. It's about being part of a team. It's about learning skills that connect you with your forefathers. And most of the people in Pico did not know how to swim. And that always amazes me, that so many of the people who would get in these boats didn't know how to swim. And here's a whale that could come and just bash your boat to pieces, and good luck. Good luck surviving that. And so that's just incredible to me. But the idea that the whale, for as much as it's beautiful to watch and to see what it means to the individuals that you're able to capture in this film, but it also continues to be meaningful for people today for all of those reasons, because it's such a symbolism. So for any of you who feel inspired to get into a whaleboat these days, you still can. And so feel free to pop on to AzoreanMaritime.org, and you can find out more information about how we use those boats today. And it's another way to continue to connect with our past, but also we use it as a way to connect to our present, to connect to our friends and family, and the people who are on the island of Pico who are still using these recreationally, mostly for the competition. I think we are more half and half. Culture and competition kind of goes hand in hand for those of us here, but they take it very seriously over there. Tony, I want to pose this next to you. What do you think keeps drawing people back to Pico? Why is it still so significant to people here in the U.S.?
Well, first of all, the film is fantastic, by the way, it really is. And Joel, your storytelling in your book brings so many memories for me, and obviously for many people in this audience and beyond. It is really incredible, right? The immigration to Brazil, the immigration to the U.S., one of my brother-in-laws, his father was born in Brazil. He was actually known as Alberto Brasileiro. Nobody knew his last name, right? So, because you had been born in a family that immigrated in the United States. My grandfather was here twice before 1924. You know what happened in 1924, right? From that point on, you needed a visa and a sponsor to come here, right? He went back, obviously. He worked in New Bedford, in Newport, and Gloucester when he was here, both times. But I think it's the connection. To me, I think it's the connection, so much, the strong connection between the New Bedford, U.S., New England, and Pico. I mean, like you said, practically every family in Pico has a connection back to that industry, right? Back to whaling. My uncle worked at that factory that you saw in Cais do Pico, right? He worked in the room they used to melt down the whale to make oil to be exported after. And yeah, they used to get paid only once a year, imagine. Even though they were so important, the money that they earned was so important. And sometimes you had to fight with the owners of the companies to actually pay on time every year. So it was a struggle sometimes. But to me, I mean, it's being in New Bedford, for example, to me, it's so comfortable because the connection as a kid back in Pico in New Bedford is like being home. Doesn't matter where I am. If I'm in New Bedford, I'm home because of that connection. And of course, every time you go to Pico, it's all those memories and flashbacks start rushing through, right? You know, and yes, it's an industry that actually the Americans talk about the Dabney family, right? I know that house, by the way, in Área Larga. As a kid, I know the house because we used to go by there. And by the way, a lot of those cottages that used to be in that area of Pico, Área Larga, is part of Madalena, they're not small cottages, big places, because they were usually owned by well-to-do families, right? There was a street in Madalena, as a little kid, I used to look at the name, and the name of the street was a little bit in Portuguese, right? It was Carlos Dabney, right? Charles Dabney, right? And as a kid, I used to say, who is this Carlos Dabney, you know? Interesting enough, I came to learn who the Dabneys were. It was actually in New Bedford. There was not a lot of storytelling about the Dabneys at that time, because they've been out of the Azores, out of Pico and Fayal for decades, right? So I came to learn, and now I know, I know why now that street is named after Carlos Dabney, right? So that's how much connection there is, right, between New Bedford and Pico, regardless if you are in Madalena or Lages or São Roque or Cais do Pico, as Guilherme likes to call it. And the reason why it's called Cais do Pico, because at one time used to be the only place that had a major port. And it was the Cais means the dock, right? But the area is really São Roque, right? And the connection here, I mean, even the words, all the words associated in the Azores with whaling, it's really American terminology, not Portuguese. I mean, it sounds like it's Portuguese, but it's not, right? Sort of, and you know, in the whaling, I mean, the first 50 years of whaling, the boats that were used in the Azores was the Yankee boat, was the American boat. Eventually, as you heard, I think it was Manuel Loming talking about, I think it was the other gentleman talked about, over the years, they began to perfect it, they began to change, adapt the boat to really be more adaptable for them and the conditions on Pico or the Azores. And today, that's why we have today the Azorean boat, which is very different than the Yankee boat. And again, it was not designed, it was not an architect, it was just the folks who actually went out and wheel on the Yankee boat that said, hey, wait a minute, this is really not working for us. We got to find a different way, and a different kind of boat to really do it.
Thank you, Tony. And I know we're running a little bit over, but I'm wondering if we might be able to have, if we have time to do at least maybe one question from the audience.
Absolutely, and then I encourage everyone to join us for the reception to ask more questions of the panelists. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thanks. All right, does anyone have a question that they're burning to ask? All right.
I think everyone will. We have a few here.
All right.
Can you wait for the mic? Just because we're recording and we want to make sure people at home are hearing you.
Thank you both. It was an excellent production tonight. Appreciate that. Question is, in 1982, after whaling ended, what was and what is now the major economy in Pico?
Oh, so the question was, what is the major economy of Pico?
Yeah, my understanding, and Tony can add to this, I'm sure, is that tourism is now the major industry on the islands, and it's drawing people from not just North America, but Europe. And since Portugal has been part of the EU, there's been a great draw of people from Europe.
Wine continues to be a major industry in Pico. Actually, the Azorean government has created incentives for younger folks to get involved in that industry and develop fields that are easier to work with. What you saw in that photo, those little things made out of volcanic rocks, it's very, very hard working on those particular areas. So now they actually have areas of the island that they actually plant, and it's almost like you think you are in Westport, on the vineyards in Westport, right? You can see the rows of vineyards, and of course, they can use, machines to really help them harvest and all that stuff. So there's a lot of investment going on in that industry, and obviously, there is a white wine called Frei Gigante, which comes from the name of the person that invented or created the first wines in Pico. I just want to touch one more thing on what Joel talked about. Some of the folks that went back, and they, at that point, going back, they're not Catholics, right? One of our neighbors, my neighbor, or my parents' neighbor, was a Seventh-day Adventist. That had been, we didn't know that. I didn't know him as a kid. I knew that he never used to go to church, right? So I said, okay. Sometimes I used to ask, why must, his name was Senor Rolim. By the way, he has folks, sons and grandsons here in the United States, in Rhode Island in particular. And I never knew why he wouldn't go to church. And then one day, he passes away, right? And now, there's the funeral, and the funeral goes straight from his home to the cemetery. There's no priest, there's no cross. And when he gets to the gates of the cemetery, some folks were not too happy that he was going to be buried there, right? But lucky enough, the cemetery is owned by the city or the town. It's a public cemetery, so anybody can be buried as a resident, So eventually there were some discussions at the gate of the cemetery, and my father was involved in those discussions because he was his neighbor, and eventually they allowed the funeral to proceed. So that's also some of the things that those who went back, who were not Catholics, they would practice different religions, confronted challenges, They used to practice, in this case, there was no church for them. They used to most likely be at home, in their own homes, or they used to come together. Those who were from either Seventh-day Adventists or Episcopalians, the Anglican Church. In New Bedford, you have a lot of Portuguese Americans that are Episcopalians, by the way. And as a leftover of that, of what happened during the immigration period.
Thank you, Tony. And we are, I'd say, out of time. But I want to thank Joel and Nick and Tony so very much for being able to add an extended layer to understanding Pico and why it matters and how there's still so much more to learn. I continue to learn all the time, so thank you very much.
How about you all
Thank
get
you
up?
to all of you.
Round of applause. Please stand. Thank you all so very much. Let's enjoy a little celebration.